She's sitting in a federal courtroom. Tears trace down her cheeks. Not just sadness, but shock. Judges and lawyers are watching her closely. The room expects sympathy, but there is one quiet detail that doesn't match her story. If her reputation was flawless, why was the prosecution so calm? No one expected her to be here. She had spent decades building a life inside the world of figure skating, shaping champions, mentoring kids, living the dream. But one night, one decision changed everything. Before this moment in the courtroom, before the judge ever spoke her sentence, she was known to many as Megan Oster-Schultz, a woman whose name carried weight in the world of American figure skating. She wasn't just another coach. She was once a champion on the ice, a former medalist whose grace and precision had earned admiration, respect, and a place in the tight-knit community of competitive skating. Teammates from her early days in competition remember her as disciplined, focused, and relentless in her pursuit of perfection. She carried that same drive into her life after skating, teaching young athletes, molding the next generation in rinks across her hometown of Kenosha, Wisconsin. Many in her community respected her. Parents trusted her with their kids, believing she knew not just how to perfect a triple toe loop, but how to guide a young athlete's character off the ice. She was admired, someone who had once stood in the spotlight and seemed to have mastered life as well. But even people who knew her well would later say they never saw the full picture. At the time, she appeared to have everything: a career built on discipline, a reputation shaped by years of dedication, and a circle of peers who trusted her implicitly. Everyone assumed she was the last person who could end up in a courtroom like this. She had built her life around rules, practice schedules, competition routines, and strict training regimens. She was someone used to being in control, someone with a reputation that seemed unassailable. And yet, in a single night in November 2024, something went terribly wrong.
Before she ever stepped into that courtroom, she was someone most Americans would recognize, at least on the surface. She was Megan Oster-Schultz, a former elite figure skater from Kenosha, Wisconsin. As a competitive athlete, she built her life on a simple idea: control through perfection. Every jump, every spin, every landing depended on precision. Success demanded repeatable motion, absolute focus, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. She wasn't just good, she was noteworthy. In her competitive years, she earned medals and respect. That reputation opened doors in the world of coaching. Parents trusted her. Other coaches admired her dedication. She became someone people expected to handle pressure, someone who could remain composed when others might falter. The culture she lived in was one of sacrifice, daily training, early mornings, late nights, a sport where missing practice was a setback, not a break. She learned to hold everything together: body, mind, reputation. That polished exterior wasn't just a choice, it was survival. And over years, habit turned into identity. Off the ice, she managed expectations the same way she managed her skating career. She kept things polished. She posted victories. She smiled for the camera. To most people around her, she was composed and untouchable. But life outside a rink doesn't have a scoreboard. There aren't judges to score your moves. There are no bright lights to blind you from every mistake. And sometimes, that makes anything more dangerous than falling on ice. Here's a detail most people never knew at the time. She hated losing control. Not just on the ice, emotionally and publicly. She avoided situations that felt unpredictable. She struggled with feelings she believed could weaken her image: fear, vulnerability, uncertainty. In her world, letting anyone see those things was like letting them break your rhythm mid-spin. For years that worked. People saw her confidence. They didn't see the effort it took to maintain it. At the time, no one thought that mattered. Not her students, not her peers, not the parents who trusted her with their children's futures, not even Megan herself. She knew how to command a room, how to command attention, and how to shape herself into the image she wanted the world to see. She carried that confidence like armor. But that armor was about to be tested in a way she could never have scripted. She stood at the center of her world. But there was someone else who shaped almost everything around her. Someone who mattered just as much, yet remained unseen by most, who only knew the polished coach and admired athlete. This was not a crime against a stranger. The other figure in this story was closer. The people she was meant to protect above all else. The victims that day were her own children, her 8-year-old son and her 6-year-old daughter. The two young lives sitting in the back seat when the vehicle pitched, flipped, and came to rest on its side. Miraculously, they walked away without serious injury, as first responders confirmed at the scene. There was a tension here, a private unease hidden behind warm family photos and community praise. On social media and in local coverage, she had posted pictures of smiling faces and joyful moments. The public saw stability, routine, love. But at the crash scene, what the officers encountered felt off. Witnesses recalled how she struggled to explain what had happened that night. She told police she didn't know how the accident occurred. When asked if any medical condition caused her memory loss, she simply said no. At first glance, it looked like any other crash, an unfortunate event on a quiet Wisconsin evening. But when officers smelled alcohol, when she couldn't remember how the crash happened, the story didn't fit the calm image the community had of her. A backup officer noted the unmistakable scent of intoxicants. When asked how many drinks she had that day, she said she had 4 White Claws, claiming she started drinking mid-afternoon. This was the first pattern interrupt in her story, the moment when the public face and the private actions collided. Here was a woman known for discipline and control, now unable to give a straight answer to basic questions. She looked toward the man sitting beside her that night, her boyfriend, but didn't respond when officers asked if she would perform a field sobriety test. Instead of steady reassurance, there was hesitation. There was a contradiction here. Quiet public harmony, warm family images, and a community that trusted her. And then this, a collision between who she was to others and what was happening in that moment. The officers on scene saw the children's car seats, the scattered water bottle with spilled liquid, and the uneasy glances she cast around her. Everyone who watched that footage later would ask themselves the same question. Did she really misjudge how much she could drink that day? Did the weight of her personal struggles, the divorce she was going through, the pressure to be the perfect mom and coach, finally overwhelm her judgment? Or was there something deeper, an internal struggle between her desire to maintain control and an emotional reality she wasn't ready to confront? At this stage, nothing had been proven yet. There were no convictions.
Did you review the plea
There were
questionnaire
just
waiver with
questions,
your attorney and fully
conflicting
understand it?
impressions,
Yes.
and a voice inside the viewer's mind asking, is this normal pressure from life's challenges or something more calculated? The crash didn't start with chaos. It started like any other weekday afternoon. No flashing lights, no raised voices, just a mother driving her kids home. At that moment, nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt dangerous. And that's exactly why what happened next mattered. It was November in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Cold air, short daylight, the kind of evening where families rush through errands before dark. Megan Oster Schultz had already been out for hours. According to police, she began drinking earlier that afternoon. Not at a bar, not at a party, just drinks spread across the day. White Claw cans, 4, by her own account. This wasn't reckless behavior in her mind. It felt controlled, measured, familiar. Mental motive. She believed spacing drinks over time meant safety. She trusted her own judgment more than the warning signs. Her 2 children were in the back seat. buckled in, quiet. An 8-year-old boy, a 6-year-old girl, the same drive she'd done countless times before. Neighbors would later say nothing looked unusual. No speeding, no swerving, no reason to worry. And that's the detail that investigators couldn't ignore later. There was no immediate alarm. Minutes passed. Music played softly. Roads curved the way they always had. This is where time stretches. Because the decision that mattered most didn't feel like a decision at all. She chose to drive. To her, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It felt normal. Later, prosecutors would focus on that moment. Not the crash, not the aftermath, but the choice to believe she was fine. Megan Oster Schultz had spent her life trusting control, training her body, managing her image, holding things together when others cracked. That confidence didn't leave her that afternoon. It stayed with her, right up until it didn't. When the vehicle left the roadway, it happened fast. Too fast for correction. The car flipped, glass shattered, metal twisted, and then silence. First responders would later confirm something unexpected. The children were alive. No life-threatening injuries. They walked away. To many people, that detail changed the tone of the story. But for investigators, it sharpened the focus. Police noticed the smell of alcohol. They noticed confusion. They noticed hesitation when she was asked simple questions. Megan told officers she didn't remember how the crash happened. She denied a medical issue. She did not complete a field sobriety test. Still, no one shouted. No one accused. Not yet. This wasn't panic. This was someone who believed the worst moment had already passed. In her mind, the kids were safe. The danger was over. And reputation, that could still be protected. But the choice that felt small earlier was about to become central to everything. At the time, it looked like a terrible accident. But accidents don't explain every detail. And soon, investigators would start asking questions that didn't fit the story she believed she was telling.
When the car finally stopped moving, the noise was gone. No screaming, no alarms yet, just cold air, broken glass, and confusion. For Megan Oster Schultz, this was the moment everything depended on what she said next. First responders arrived to a flipped vehicle on a quiet road in Kenosha County. The children were already out of the car, standing, breathing, alive. That detail mattered. It shaped how everyone reacted next. Officers later confirmed the kids did not suffer serious injuries. At first glance, it looked like the worst had been avoided, and that belief lowered the temperature in the air. Megan appeared shaken, but composed enough to speak. She answered questions. She stayed upright. She did not cry right away. When officers asked what happened, her answer was simple. She said she didn't know. She couldn't explain how the car left the road. She couldn't recall losing control. She said it all happened too fast. At that moment, her explanation didn't raise alarms. People forget details after accidents. Shock does that. Megan Oster Schultz told police she had been driving normally. She said she wasn't speeding. She said there was no medical emergency. Then came another question. Had she been drinking? She said yes. She told officers she had consumed 4 White Claw drinks earlier that day. She said she started drinking in the afternoon. She believed enough time had passed. This was her logic. Space the drinks. Eat food. Stay functional. To her, that meant safe. As the questions continued, her tone shifted. She became quieter, more careful. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She looked toward her boyfriend. She paused before answering. This wasn't panic. It was calculation under pressure. Years of managing appearances had taught her when to speak and when not to. This is where things began to change. Quietly. An officer noted the smell of alcohol. Another noticed her uncertainty didn't match the damage to the car. She said she didn't remember the crash, but she remembered the drinks clearly. That contrast stayed with them. No one accused her on the spot. No cuffs yet, no raised voices. But the story was no longer settling the way it had at first. Individually, her answers were reasonable. Together, they didn't fit cleanly. She was confident enough to drive, uncertain enough to forget the crash, detailed about alcohol, vague about everything else. To officers, this wasn't proof, but it was a signal. And something about the story required patience. And patience, in cases like this, changes everything. Megan Oster-Schultz believed the danger had passed. The kids were okay. The worst moment was over. What she didn't realize yet was that the real test wasn't the crash. It was how every word she spoke would be weighed later, slowly, carefully, and without sympathy for reputation. That night ended without answers, but investigators weren't finished listening, because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with noise. It waits. The night ended quietly. No jail cell, no public accusation, no headline yet. And that silence worked in her favor. From the start, law enforcement treated Megan Oster-Schultz differently than most drivers involved in a rollover crash with alcohol involved. She was calm, she was cooperative, she was educated, well-spoken, and known in the community. Officers noted her answers. They documented the scene, but they did not rush to judgment. Her history mattered. Former elite figure skater, youth coach, mother. Those labels created space, not immunity, but patience. When early reports surfaced, the language was careful: a crash, children unharmed, a coach involved, not a threat, not a warning, not a pattern. Headlines focused on relief, not risk. To the public, it sounded like a bad night that ended with luck. And that framing shaped perception before facts were fully examined. In Kenosha, support moved quickly. Parents who knew her from the rink spoke up. People described her as dedicated, someone who cared deeply about kids. There was shock, but not suspicion. To many, this didn't fit the person they thought they knew. And once a story settles into that shape, it becomes harder to challenge. But investigators weren't finished. As reports were reviewed, a small gap appeared. Megan said she started drinking in the afternoon. She said she spaced the drinks out. She said she felt okay to drive. But the timeline didn't fully line up. There was a window of time, short but important, where her movements weren't clearly accounted for. Not proof, just uncertainty. And uncertainty makes investigators slow down. At the crash site, and on officers noted items inside the vehicle, a water bottle with liquid still inside, personal belongings shifted by the rollover. Nothing dramatic, but one detail stood out later. Where certain items ended up didn't fully match her explanation of how the crash happened. It wasn't evidence yet, it was friction. Then there was her account. At first she said she didn't remember the crash at all. Later details appeared. Small ones. Clarifications. Adjustments. Nothing major. Nothing dramatic. But experienced investigators noticed consistency more than emotion, and consistency was starting to drift. Megan Oster-Schultz believed her life spoke for itself. Her discipline, her career, her role as a mother. She didn't see herself as someone who needed defending, and that belief shaped every word she gave. But investigations don't run on reputation. They run on details, and details don't care who you are. For a while, it looked like the story might end here. An accident, a warning, a second chance. But one detail refused to stay quiet. And when investigators followed it, everything changed.
The case didn't move forward with a bang. It moved forward with a pause, a moment where someone stopped talking and started listening more closely. Days after the crash, investigators returned to the reports, not because they doubted the outcome, but because one small detail refused to settle. Megan Oster-Schultz said she didn't remember how the crash happened. She said everything went blank. But the data told a different story. Not a full answer. Not a smoking gun. Just enough friction to make someone uncomfortable. Phone records showed activity where she claimed memory loss. Not dramatic use. Not frantic calls. Just normal actions that suggested awareness. Investigators didn't rush to conclusions. They compared times. They matched movements. And suddenly, the timeline looked tighter than her explanation allowed. But there was no dramatic lab reveal, no courtroom gasp, just routine evidence doing what it always does. The smell officers noted, the drinks she admitted to, the timing of the drive. Individually, each detail made sense. Together, they began leaning in the same direction. Still, not enough to accuse, but enough to worry. Up to this point, sympathy had carried the story. A respected coach, a mother, a crash where no one died. But now, doubt entered quietly. Not about her emotions, about her certainty. She was sure she was okay to drive. Sure she was in control. Sure her judgment could be trusted. The evidence didn't argue. It just disagreed. This wasn't about intention to harm. It was about confidence crossing a line. Megan Oster-Schultz trusted her ability to manage outcomes. She trusted her history. She trusted the image she'd spent years building. But evidence doesn't respond to confidence. It responds to timing. At this point, ask yourself this. Would you still believe her? The story hadn't collapsed yet, but it had changed shape. And soon, questions would turn into arguments. Not on the road, but in a courtroom.
By now, the facts weren't shouting. They were whispering. And whispers are harder to ignore than noise. Because this story was no longer about a crash. It was about control. And what happens when control starts to slip. For Megan Oster-Schultz, image wasn't a side detail. It was the foundation of her life. From the rink to the classroom to her role as a coach, she had learned that how people see you can matter as much as what you do. Elite sports reward discipline, composure, and confidence. They punish mistakes, especially public ones. So when investigators reviewed her behavior after the crash, they didn't just see stress, they saw protection. She answered carefully. She avoided emotional outbursts. She stayed measured. This wasn't denial, it was preservation. Investigators and psychologists often look for panic in moments like this. Raised voices, erratic behavior, emotional collapse. But Megan Oster-Schultz didn't unravel that way. Instead, she appeared wounded by something else, the sudden threat to the identity she believed she had earned. A respected coach, a responsible parent, someone who followed rules. When that image cracked, the response wasn't chaos. It was control tightening. This wasn't about escaping consequences in her mind. It was about refusing to see herself as the person others were beginning to describe. Elite performers often live with a quiet fear, not fear of failure, but fear of falling from grace. You don't just lose a job, you lose status, trust, a name people once admired. For Megan Oster-Schultz, that fear had weight. Her career depended on parents believing in her judgment, on institutions trusting her around children, on the idea that she was steady under pressure. A single night threatened all of that. And when fear meets identity, people don't always react to danger. They react to loss. This is why her story worked at first. She didn't look reckless. She didn't sound careless. She sounded like someone who believed she had made a reasonable choice, and that belief was genuine. But belief doesn't override reality. Investigators weren't judging her character. They were measuring facts against certainty, and the gap between those two kept widening. So here's the question that matters most. Was Megan Oster-Schultz reacting to danger or losing control of her narrative? The investigation had crossed a line. What began as patience was turning into scrutiny, and soon her story wouldn't belong to her anymore. It would belong to the court.
The first tear fell before the judge said a word. It landed softly, right on time. In this room, emotion was no longer personal. It was strategy. When Megan Oster-Schultz walked into the courtroom, the case shifted again. This wasn't about road conditions or timelines anymore. This was about who she was supposed to be. The defense leaned into that image immediately. A former elite figure skater. A youth coach trusted by families. A mother who made a mistake. Not a threat. Every detail pointed back to identity, not denial, not argument, context. When she spoke, her voice cracked. Her shoulders dropped. She cried, Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. She talked about her children, her regret, her fear of letting people down. This wasn't about fighting the evidence. It was about softening it. In American courtrooms, emotion matters. It humanizes. It reframes. And for a moment it worked. There was an unspoken expectation in the room. She wasn't a repeat offender. No one died. The children survived. This was a case where leniency felt possible. The defense didn't ask for mercy directly. They implied it. They trusted the court to see what they saw. A woman whose life was already unraveling without further punishment. But not everyone in the room was convinced. Some observers noticed the timing of the emotion. The pauses. The way the tears appeared only when the narrative required them. To a few people watching closely, the display felt practiced, not fake, but managed. Like someone used to performing under pressure. This was familiar territory for Megan Oster-Schultz. She had spent years competing in front of judges, reading reactions, adjusting presentation. The courtroom wasn't ice. But the rules felt similar. Stay composed, show effort, show remorse, control the moment. But legal judgment isn't scored like a routine, and some performances raise more questions than answers. This was the last time she could shape the story herself. After this, facts would speak louder than feeling. Records would matter more than reputation. And the calm confidence she once relied on was about to be tested in a way no competition ever had. The courtroom was quiet again. The judge hadn't ruled yet. But the strategy had been revealed, and soon the evidence would have its turn.
The courtroom was quiet, but the case wasn't. While emotion filled the room, the evidence kept moving. And evidence doesn't respond to tears. Prosecutors didn't rush. They didn't challenge her story head-on. They let the details speak, one at a time. The first contradiction came from timing. Megan Oster-Schultz said she spaced her drinks carefully. She said enough hours had passed. She said she felt normal when she drove. But phone records and activity logs placed her alert and active during periods she later described as unclear, not dramatic use. Just enough interaction to challenge the idea of total memory loss. That didn't prove guilt, but it weakened the foundation. Next came the physical evidence. Officers had documented the scene carefully. The vehicle's position, the items inside, the way the car left the roadway. Her explanation suggested a sudden, unavoidable event, but the damage pattern didn't fully support that. Investigators didn't say it out loud at first. They compared notes. They waited. Because once you say it, you have to prove it. Then came the part that changed the tone. It wasn't about how much she drank. It was about what she chose to do afterward. She admitted drinking. She admitted driving. She admitted her children were in the car. This wasn't hidden behavior. It was a decision she stood by, at first. That's when the narrative shifted. Not from accident to crime, but from accident to responsibility. By now, the audience could see it. The confidence, the timing, the calm certainty that she knew better. This wasn't confusion. It was belief. Belief that she could manage the risk. Belief that experience meant immunity. A belief that control would hold. Before the court confirmed it, the pattern was already clear. This wasn't a mistake. It was preparation. Preparation built on habit, on confidence, on years of getting things right and assuming the rules would bend. But the law doesn't bend for experience. Once intent entered the conversation, sympathy lost its grip. The evidence didn't accuse loudly. It aligned quietly. And alignment is what juries and judges trust. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It arrived piece by piece. And when it finished assembling, the courtroom saw something very different from what it expected.
The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't gasp. It didn't react at all. And that silence said more than any verdict ever could. Up to this point, the room had leaned toward understanding, Now it leaned toward judgment. The judge looked down at the case file, then up at Megan Oster-Schultz. This wasn't the first time the judge had seen tears. It wasn't the first time someone asked to be seen for who they were before one bad decision. But the tone shifted. The judge's voice was calm, measured, firm. This wasn't personal, it was procedural, and that distinction mattered. When the prosecutor spoke, the emotion left the room entirely. There was no anger, no raised voice, no accusation, just facts. She admitted drinking, she admitted driving, she admitted her children were in the car. This wasn't about how she felt afterward. It was about what she chose before. The prosecutor didn't challenge her character. They challenged her certainty, the belief that she knew better, that she could manage risk. That experience made her different. As those words settled, something shifted in Megan Oster-Schultz's face. Just for a moment, her eyes dropped, her jaw tightened. The confidence she'd carried through the process faltered. Not fear, recognition. This was the instant she understood the room had changed sides. For years, Megan Oster-Schultz had relied on composure, in competition, in coaching, in life. But this wasn't a performance space. This was a place where intention mattered more than identity. And control, once lost, doesn't come back. Then the judge said the words that ended the strategy. Reputation is irrelevant now. No emphasis, no pause. Just a statement of fact. Everything Megan Oster-Schultz believed would protect her had officially stopped working. This was the pivot. Not because of punishment, not because of headlines, but because the story changed meaning. This was no longer about a respected coach who made a bad call. It was about accountability. Stripped of status. The court had spoken, and now only consequences remained.
When the verdict came, it didn't feel loud. It felt final. The room stayed still. And for the first time, Megan Oster-Schultz had nothing left to manage. The judge read the decision without drama. No speeches, no raised voice, no pause for effect. Megan Oster-Schultz was held accountable for her actions that night, for driving after drinking with her children in the car. The sentence followed the law. It wasn't shaped by her past achievements. It wasn't softened by her reputation. This wasn't about who she had been. It was about what she did. As the words settled, something else happened, something harder to measure. The image she had built over decades began to fall apart. Not in a dramatic way, not with tears or protests, but with stillness. She no longer looked like a coach, or an athlete, or a leader. She looked like someone realizing that control had limits. The consequences didn't end with the sentence. Trust was gone. Professional standing weakened. A name once spoken with respect now carried an asterisk. Parents questioned decisions they once accepted without hesitation. Institutions reviewed roles they once offered freely. This wasn't about punishment alone. It was about access to credibility, to authority, to the benefit of the doubt. For someone who lived by precision and preparation, this was the hardest loss. She had trusted herself more than the risk. She had trusted her experience more than the rules. And now, that confidence had a price. Not just in court, but in every space where judgment mattered. There was no victory here. No lesson announced from the bench. Just a reminder that outcomes don't always match intent. And the children went home. The court moved on. And Megan Oster-Schultz walked out knowing that the story she once controlled no longer belonged to her. The case was closed, but the questions it raised were not. When the courtroom emptied, the case was over. But the story wasn't, because the most important question didn't belong to the judge. It belonged to everyone watching. For years, Megan Oster-Schultz lived inside an identity that worked. Elite athlete, coach, mother, someone people trusted without asking questions. That identity wasn't a lie, but it became a shield. A way to believe that rules applied differently. That experience could replace caution. That good intentions could soften consequences. And for a long time, it did. Perception shaped everything in this case. How officers responded, how the community reacted, how long doubt took to surface. People saw what they expected to see. A composed woman, a careful professional. Someone who wouldn't put her own kids at risk. And because that picture felt familiar, it was trusted. Until it wasn't. The most dangerous belief in this story wasn't about alcohol. It wasn't about driving. It was about certainty. The belief that she knew herself well enough to judge risk. That she could feel when something crossed a line. That her past discipline guaranteed future judgment. That belief didn't come from arrogance. It came from repetition. From years of getting it right. And that's how self-deception works. It sounds reasonable. Until reality disagrees. Megan Oster Schultz believed control came from preparation, from confidence, from reputation, from staying composed. But the truth revealed something else. Control didn't disappear all at once. It slipped away quietly. When choices felt familiar instead of risky. When identity replaced judgment. When perception delayed accountability. So ask yourself this. At what moment do you think the truth became undeniable? Was it the crash, the evidence, or the moment reputation stopped working? The case was resolved, but the question remains. Who was really in control? Long after the court date ended, something else followed her home. Not a sentence, not paperwork, but silence. Justice was reached. The case was closed, but the damage didn't stop at the courthouse doors. For Megan Oster Schultz, the loss went deeper than legal consequences. It lived in how people spoke her name, in how parents hesitated, in how trust, once automatic, now required explanation. No announcement marked that moment. It happened quietly. The image she spent years building didn't shatter in one day. It faded, one unanswered question at a time, one pause in conversation, one closed door. There were no crowds, no protests, no public outrage, just absence. And absence can be louder than judgment. This case wasn't about a moment. It was about belief. Belief in control. Belief in identity. A belief that a good reputation could soften reality. And that belief didn't collapse loudly. It slipped away when it was no longer needed by the truth. Was this about one bad decision? Or about how far confidence can go before it stops protecting you? That answer depends on who's watching. She thought her reputation would save her. But in the end, it was the very thing that exposed her.